A very good morning to everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our webinar today. My name is Rima Afani. I'm curator of the Emirates Soil Museum, and I'll be moderating today's event. So every year, the 17th of June is observed worldwide as Desertification and Drought Day. On this day, we take the opportunity to raise awareness about local, regional, and international efforts to combat desertification and manage, mitigate, and adapt to drought. We also take the opportunity to spread a positive message of hope, and that is that desertification and drought can be effectively tackled if there is collective will and action. And this message is well captured through this year's slogan, which is rising up from drought together. Just to share some facts and numbers with you, it is estimated that about 55 million people worldwide are affected by drought every year. Drought is also the most serious hazard to livestock and crops in nearly every part of the world. And droughts around the world are becoming more frequent, prolonged, and severe. And according to a 2022 report by the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, drought frequency and duration has increased by 29% around the world since the year of 2000. So I'd like to welcome you all today to this very special webinar organized by the International Center for Biodiversity Agriculture and the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment of the United Arab Emirates. In line with this year's slogan for the Desertification and Drought Day, today's webinar will serve as a platform for sharing ideas and thoughts on how to manage, mitigate, and adapt to the impact of drought. So without further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Augusto Becerra, Chief Scientist at ICBA, to give the opening remarks.
Thank you, Rima, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, no threat to our planet is probably as acute as climate change. Its catastrophic consequences will vary from one part of the world to another, putting our global food system at risk. While in some regions, its impact appears projected to be less severe, in others, specifically characterized by arid and semi-arid environments, will be much more devastating. One effect of climate change is the water, and it will get scarce, and drought will become more frequent, and extreme weather conditions will be prevalent in more corners of the world. Unfortunately, this forecast holds true East Africa and Central Asia. So drought, no doubt, around the world will become more frequent, prolonged, and severe. As we heard from Rima, according to the report of the UN, United Nations Convention for Combat Desertification, drought will be more prevalent and has increased, with no doubt, from 2000, 29%. Which is more important is that since drought became more prevalent, $124 billion has been lost. And that affects, obviously, the poorest. 1/3 of the world is composed by smallholder farmers. And the region which most suffered from this is Africa. Climate change induced drought will put the life and livelihoods of millions of people at risk and increase unemployment in rural areas, causing economic problems for many countries. And it will also intensify the competition for scarce resources, and water will become eventually a problem of crisis. And so it's important that a discussion between countries is established so that water resources are available for our future food security. It is therefore crucial and important to develop adaptation and mitigation strategies backed by evidence-based research. And this is all about what we're going to be talking today, to reduce the negative impact of drought on national economies and communities. So such a strategy should form the cornerstone of sustainable agricultural development, as well as food security in the region and around the world. Our center, ICBA, focus a lot on the efforts of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. We have been assisting decision makers in different countries by providing them with decision support tools to better manage and respond to drought and desertification. For example, our scientists have helped 4 countries in the Middle East to monitor drought and to create systems that manage better the problem of desertification. And this, of course, in collaboration with stakeholders around the world, Our center has enhanced the capacity and continue to support our partners in Jordan, Lebanon, and Morocco to monitor and respond better to drought problems. Collaboration then at every level will be central to the success of any adaptation and mitigation strategies. Decision-making process will be coordinated within and between the countries, supported by real data produced by centers like ICBA. It is also necessary to share successful experiences and lessons learned from different regions at various forms and platforms. And our meeting today will aim to that. It will provide an overview of effective strategies and solutions for drought management, mitigation, and adaptation. As we have scientists and experts from the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment of the UAE and the International Center for Biodiversity and Agriculture, I'm confident we will have a very substantive discussion. It is my pleasure. I'm looking forward to hear our colleagues' thoughts and insights on this important subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the insightful remarks, Dr. Augusto. So we'll now get started with the panel discussion. The focus will be on how to better prepare for drought. Our panel today brings together various scientists and experts. So we have with us Mr. Rashid Zaboul, who's climate modeling scientist from ICBA in the UAE, Dr. Ahmed Al-Nagar, soil management scientist from ICBA in the UAE, and Dr. Namo, who's also senior agronomist at ICBA in the UAE. But we're also very pleased to have Ms. Maitha Abdullah Al-Mheri from Ministry of Climate Change and Environment of the United Arab Emirates. So we'll begin with Mr. Rashid Zaboul, who's climate modeling scientist. Mr. Rashid, can you tell us a little bit more about the linkages between drought, desertification, and aridity?
Thank you very much, Rima. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to participate in this session on drought, desertification, and aridity to celebrate the day of combating desertification and drought. And yes, the linkages, we're talking about linkages between drought, desertification, and aridity. Let me just start with some definition of drought, desertification, and aridity to understand the different concepts and then come to the linkages between them. So I think, as it is well known, drought is a prolonged dry period in the natural climate cycle that can occur anywhere in the world. It is a slow onset disaster that is characterized by lack of precipitation. Of course, this lack of precipitation results in water shortage. So drought can have a serious impact on health, agriculture, economies, energy, and environment, as mentioned by Dr. Augusto previously. While desertification is a land degradation process in arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas, which are collectively known as dry lands. So desertification is only known in or targeting or being defined in those areas in the world, the dry lands. So this desertification is resulting from many factors, including human activities and climate variations. So the range and intensity of desertification have increased in some dryland areas over the past several decades. And currently, drylands cover about 46% of the global land area. And it is home to 3 billion people. So the multiplicity and complexity of the processes of desertification make it difficult to quantify. Desertification hotspots, as identified by a decline in vegetation productivity between the 90s and 2000s, extend to about 9% of drylands. of course, affecting about 500 million people in 2015. Now, the aridity, in contrast with desertification and drought, is a long-term climatic feature characterized by low average of precipitation or available water. So aridity is different from drought, which is a temporary climatic event. And in addition, droughts are not restricted to dry lands, while aridity and desertification are. Drought can occur in both dry lands and humid areas. So to summarize, the linkages between drought, desertification, and aridity, or those three main concepts, are linked through time scale. So the prolonged period of drought causes soil degradation, loss of soil fertility characteristics or organic characteristics, leading to desertification. And then over time, when the soil loses all its organic properties, the aridity takes over. So this is what happened in the Arabian Peninsula and the Grand Desert in Africa across millions of years. So those are basically the main linkages between drought, desertification, and aridity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid. It's indeed very interesting to understand the differences and the linkages between drought, aridity, and desertification. Now, focusing on drought in the Middle East and North Africa region, can you tell us a little bit more about the current situation and what the projections for the near and long term look like?
Yes. So actually the risks that the drought poses to communities, ecosystems, and economies are much larger and more profound than can be measured. And drought impacts are extensive across societies. They are interconnected across large areas and cascade through socio-ecological and technical systems at different scales, and can also remain through time. So a lack of awareness of such characteristics of drought itself, including the consistent underestimation of cost of drought impacts, can lead to, and has led in the past to, ineffective response and systemic failure. You have mentioned during your introduction that the United Nations estimated that 55 million people globally are affected by droughts every year. And droughts are the most serious hazard to livestock and crops. Okay, this has been mentioned during the introduction. So drought threatens people's livelihood, increase the risk of disease and death. In addition to what has been mentioned by Dr. Augusto, that water scarcity impacts 40% of the world's population. And it is expected that as many as 700 million people are at risk of being displaced as a result of drought by 2030. So what has happened due to climate change, especially the rising of temperature, has made already dry regions drier and wet regions wetter. So in dry regions, like in MENA region, for example, this means that when temperature rises, water evaporates more quickly, and thus increases the risk of drought or prolongs the periods of drought. During the last 10 years, between 80 to 90% of all documented disasters from natural hazards resulted from floods as first hazard, followed by drought, then followed by other natural hazards, tropical cyclones, heat waves, and severe storms. So in MENA region, over the last decade, drought episodes have increased in frequency and severity, and have spread over large areas of territory, of course, bringing misery and suffering to some of the region's most vulnerable communities. The MENA region is the driest region in the world, where periodic drought is a threat to food and water security. The region is already facing challenges from the limited water supply. Not only that, but political instability and desertification. And it has only 2% of the world's renewable water supplies. So this is the current situation. The drought has already occurred many times with different degrees of severity in different parts of the growing season, leading to crop failure and socioeconomic impacts, negative impacts. The projections, in fact, as mentioned by Dr. Agosto again, while drought has always been a threat, climate change projections suggest that many areas will experience droughts that are more frequent and more severe. And this makes the key issues such as how well society is coping with drought and the availability of governance, tools, and approaches to reduce, in fact, the cost of drought. All those issues will be more pressing. In MENA region, according to the sixth assessment report, precipitation will likely decrease by 20% across the entire region, especially in North Africa, reaching even more than 30% in Morocco, while the annual rainfall will likely increase by between 10% to more than 40% in the Arabian Peninsula, depending on the level of global warming considered. This will likely lead to decrease in available soil moisture by more than 1.5 of its standard deviation across North Africa, especially in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and an increase in this soil moisture by more than 1.5 of its standard deviation in the Arabian Peninsula. So MENA region will be impacted differently by drought in the future. North Africa will suffer more, especially because of the projected decrease in annual rainfall, while the Arabian Peninsula will get wetter. But again, we need to pay attention to the kind of rainfall that will be received by the Arabian Peninsula. It's not a uniform kind of rain, but episodic high intensity rainfalls that need to be managed to not suffer from the other main risk, that is flood, and to in fact take this advantage of having more rain to capture it and store it in reservoirs underground, for example, to deal with drought in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid, for your insights. It's of course very interesting to look at the past and current situation, but also very important to look at these projections that will surely help us prepare and minimize the impact of drought that is certainly coming. Now, moving on, let us have a look at the effects of desertification on soils in arid and semi-arid regions with Dr. Ahmed Al-Nagar, soil management scientist. So, Dr. Ahmed, can you tell us about the soil properties and soil processes that are associated with desertification?
Yeah, thank you, Rima, and thanks for the organizer for inviting me to join this talk about desertification and the drought. Actually, the most obvious, property of the desert is reduced biodiversity. Of course, lack of drought and aridity and so on. To describe that, I would like to share my screen with you. Can you see my screen now? So, sometimes we forget about also the interrelation between desertification and the climate change. Of course, I mean, climate change is one of the main causes for desertification, but also desertification directly or indirectly could lead to more climate change. And this is sometimes scientists, they call this like a vicious cycle. So climate change lead to more desertification, and desertification leads to higher impact on climate change. So the most obvious process that happens actually is the loss of biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity in terms of the number of species, and also in terms of the quantity. So when soil, I mean, we have to keep in mind that desertification, as explained by my colleague Rashid, is actually a long-term process, and it's also a gradual process. It does not happen, you know, like in one night, but it takes quite long time. So during the desertification, a bit by bit, soil loses its biodiversity in terms of vegetation, microbes, flora, and fauna, and so on. And with this loss also, we have loss in soil organic matter and loss of carbon from the soil. And this carbon goes again back to the atmosphere and causes more impacts on the atmosphere and participate in the greenhouse gases emission in the atmosphere. So this is what we call the interrelation between desertification, climate change. If we look to the soil, and soil is vital part of the ecosystem. Soil is also is not only affected by climate change, but also it has like a main impact on the climate change. So with the desertification and this climate change happening or taking place, the main factor or the main soil property is affected is the loss of biodiversity, and also changes in the dominant species, because when you have the ecosystem is changing its characteristics, some organisms will be more adapted to the new ecosystem rather than others. So also there are changes in the dominant species that is living in the soil, whether it is like plant or microbes or fungi or bacteria or whatever. Also, of course, the loss of organic matter, the loss of soil carbon will have a main impact on soil properties, on soil productivity. We know that soil organic matter is giving the soil most of its properties in terms of holding nutrients, in terms of improving the soil structure. So with the loss of organic matter and loss of organic carbon, soils deteriorate actually significantly, which lead to more deterioration in its properties in terms of nutrient retention. So desertified soil become more vulnerable to climate change. Its structure will deteriorate and make it more vulnerable to drought, and of course its productivity will be deteriorated. So this is why we are hoping to combat drought, and we are doing our best and looking for technologies to rehabilitate soil that is affected by desertification.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, for the thorough information. It's indeed very, very interesting and very important to take into consideration the impact on soils, but also to know about different technologies and soil management practices that are crucial to combating desertification. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Now, our next expert is Dr. Namu, a senior agronomist. Dr. Namu, from your experience in crop diversification and genetics, can you tell us a little bit about the effects of drought and desertification on crop production prospects?
Thanks, Rima.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some ideas on this important day, the World Environment Day. So let me start by putting some few words into the definition of what drought is from the standpoint of looking at the crop and how we produce crops. So drought, we have heard from colleagues that it's an event that is characterized by a prolonged lack of precipitation. And then this lack of precipitation in an ecosystem that normally relies on water changes the whole dynamic of how crops, plants, for example, trees, and the microbial community around plants and trees survive. So that whole thing changes. Okay, so in the definition, the thing that I want to put here is the time, the effect of time without water that affects, that impacts heavily on crop production. Okay, it's also the impact of just having little water in the system that impacts crop production. And you may want to know that if you look at the hydrological water cycle, with droughts, we have less water in the soil system. We have reduced water tables. Now that affects the impact of trees, crops, and the microbial communities around these to access water and to proliferate. So the impact is huge. And all these areas that have been delineated as having increased incidences of drought, they are facing this challenge where water is not available and for prolonged periods of time, and this has got impact on the amount of productivity, the amount of biomass crops can accumulate during this period and in the overall season. The amount of production and amount of biomass that trees and the microbial communities around these systems will produce. So it's very important to say the impact, like my colleague has already said, is heavy on biodiversity. With droughts, we are running less, or we are running short of the diversity that we find in crops, in trees, and in the associated microbial community. So drought reduces the species of crops that we can actually grow to produce food. That's the first big impact that we have. And the reason why efforts are important to produce, to breed more crops which fit into such conditions is sooner or later, with increased droughts, we run out of options of which species to run to. So this is a very important point that I'm trying to make here, that availability of those crops that we can select to grow reduces. As the frequency increases, as the time the droughts take increases, we're going to have less and less crops that can fit into such environments. And here in the UAE, we're already in an environment where water scarcity is dominant. So in the work that we are doing, we're trying to, to mimic the future in those regions where we're still having reasonable amounts of rainfall that have not fallen below the average rainfalls over time. We're going to have less and less water, which is the situation we have here in the UAE. And we are taking this environment to test the range of crops that we can actually run to when drought dominates in those areas that are now under threat. So the other thing that I've wanted to emphasize is with plants, soil, and microbial linkage. Once we have drought, that linkage breaks down. Okay, so with a reduced number of plants, we also have we're going to have reduced number of microbes that grow around these crops, and in the end, we also have a reduced soil biodiversity. My colleague has already made a good case about biodiversity. So soil health. If you view soil health, soil is a medium of growing crops, and the number of crops that we can grow being the limit to what we can, we can support in terms of food security. This whole system breaks down, it means we are losing more. Biodiversity, yes, but the combination and the interactions of crops and soils and soil biology also goes away. So this is one of the big losses that we're going to have. We may not be able to produce a lot more crops more efficiently without these interactions of crops and microbes. Let's go to the impact at plant or crop species level. At species level, many things go on. The physiological processes that crops rely on to generate or to complete their life cycle, they are disturbed. Photosynthesis, for example, everybody knows a bigger component of it is water. So without water, even if we have a lot of carbon dioxide, we may not be able to produce the sugars that the crop relies on in building its biomass. And this biomass is what feeds us. So at plant level, basic physiological processes are disturbed. These processes are important. I've just talked about water and carbon dioxide, but let me extend that and say, under drought, plants fail now to absorb nutrients, and that's a big problem. If we don't have this system of absorption of nutrients and conversion into sugars, and sugars are the ones that end up supporting the process of producing grain and fruits and so on, we have a problem. So these are the major impacts that we're going to have. Water absorption, definitely when there is a drought, the crop adjusts physiologically, reduces the amount of water that is going to abstract from the soil. But with increased transpiration, that balance between transpiration and the amount of water that the plant can take also changes, affecting negatively the crop. So the crop development is reduced. So in short, what I'm saying is number of species that will fit into environments are going to be less and less. We need a lot of breeding to do, a lot of selection of germplasm that will fit to this environment for us to continue to produce yields and produce food. So let me stop at that and say the impacts, mainly biodiversity, mainly the number of plant species. Plant species, I'm referring to crops, but I'm also referring to even forest species, tree species that can fit in there, and the associated soil biology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Namo. It's indeed very interesting to see how heavy the impact is on crop production, which is why it's also very important to focus on innovations. So very briefly, Dr. Namo, can you tell us about different innovations that can be applied to improve crop production under drought and heat stress?
So thank you very much, Rima. Let me emphasize, in the definition of drought, please, let's also include heat stress, okay? Often, under drought conditions, there is water shortage, but also high temperatures are associated with drought conditions. So heat is a stress factor that actually affects the whole game of producing crops in most of these areas. So with regards to innovations, here at the center, we're working on many innovations. One of them is specifically speaks to the first point that I mentioned, the range of crops that can fit in drought conditions. In other words, the process of breeding, the process of selection is very important, and the center holds these exercises very important, and the contribution to this will contribute directly to food security. Food security in the drought-prone areas, but also food security in general in providing a mix between crops that can be produced in non-drought-prone areas, especially the major cereals, the legumes, and so on, and crops that can be produced in drought-prone areas. Remember, food security is going to be a sum total of producing in those reasonable, in those good environments, but also producing in marginal environments. If we were to throw away production in marginal environments, the food security scale would tilt very badly. And my colleague has already quoted, millions who rely in this, who reside and do agriculture or perform agriculture in drought-prone areas. So the first thing is the provision, the diversification of these crops that can fit in drought environments. Let me take the second point, which is the cropping systems associated with drought conditions. With cropping systems, let me pick on one point, which is the crop combinations that we can put together to produce sustainably under drought or dry conditions. So there is a need for us to define optimal production in these production areas. The reason why we need to do that is under any situation where resources are limited, there has to be optimization. If we blindly just produce any crop, a water-loving crop, for example, in a drought-prone area, we end up tilting things like the water table, and the overall amount of water that is available for production of anything else goes down. So the cropping systems, the choice of which annual crops, which perennial crops, and which supportive biodiversity species that we produce in these environments is very important. This is an area where we can innovate and we can sell models, or we can publicize models that support optimization of use of resources, water, nutrients, and other in these environments. Let me move in and say innovations also apply to what my colleague has already talked about, the soil, with regards to which amendments should we use, should we popularize in drought-prone areas, which fertilizer systems, combinations of organics and mineral fertilizers should we push? Bearing in mind that even in dry areas, we can also produce in a manner that increases greenhouse gas emissions. All of us are now aware that the environment requires us to be low on emissions, to be close to sea neutrality. So this is very important to combine the soil management practices with the crop management practices. I want to rush and say, look, there's also competition in this environment between weeds and plants, okay, weeds and crops. So we have to manage our systems in a manner that reduces this competition so that we don't lose a lot more water. If we leave weeds to compete vigorously with crops, then we lose the whole game. Let me say lastly, there are many things that we can be done in terms of innovation, but we also need to automate certain things. There's a very popular early warning system in multiple parameters that are associated with drought. For example, with water. Okay, there are sensor systems that we can use to detect, okay, the plant now needs water. There are also early warning systems around pests. But the center is working on all this. But probably ultimately we need a whole set of automation where sensors are in places where we think resources need to be managed, including sensing for salinity, sensing for nutrients in the soil. And in one go, a farmer can actually see where to optimize around all these resources that we need to manage. So let me repeat again. Is a list of crops in the, that fit in this environment. Is the cropping system. Is the soil and water management systems that we implement for crops. And it's also the early warning sensing mechanisms that we put that can advise farmers with minimal resources, with a chip which can be used also solar systems. I want to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Namo. Hearing about all these innovations and measures certainly gives us a very positive message of hope that desertification and drought can be effectively tackled. Thank you, Dr. Namo. Now, we're going to shift our attention to the United Arab Emirates with another expert in the field. So we have with us Ms. Maitha Abdullah Al-Mheri from Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. So earlier in the discussion, Mr. Rashid briefed us about the current situation in the Middle East and the North Africa region. And he also talked a bit about the projections for the near and long term. So Ms. Maitha, can you tell us a little bit more about different measures that are taken by the UAE in order to address these threats and some of the success stories that can be shared?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Rima, for the introduction, and I would like to thank the panelists for their informative presentation and the facts they gave us. So, as the panelists said, globally, desertification, land degradation, and drought are great threats to the economic and social development of any country. Drought have always been a part of nature and the human experience, but with climate change, its effects could be worsened. The challenging environment condition in the UAE, including the high temperature and the water scarcity, are natural drivers of land degradation and drought, as the panelists explained. So, desert accounts for 80% of our country's territory, which make us all more cautious to preserve our vital ecosystems and the services they provide. Some of the projects we've done, first of all, the United Arab Emirates became a member of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification in 1998 and had drafted its first national strategy to combat desertification in 2003. And to ensure the implementation of the convention requirement, there have been a lot of programs and initiatives that have been developed. So, for example, in our efforts to fight desertification, we focus with our stakeholders on using modern technologies and science-based measures to protect native plants, encourage biodiversity, and reduce groundwater depletion. In the UAE, there are several strategies and policies that have been developed, and those strategies complement each other's. For example, the water security strategy, the national food security strategy, and the UAE net zero by 2050 strategic initiative to achieve the net zero emission by 2050. Those are all interlinked with each other and all can contribute in achieving the national strategy for compacting desertification, which the ministry is currently working on and updating it to cover the period 2022 to 2030. Some of the projects that I could highlight and that I could say that they are a success story in the UAE is the UAE research program for rain enhancement science, which is an initiative designed to improve water security in arid and semi-arid areas around the world. Through such active support for research and development innovation, the UAE is playing part in strengthening work in this field. As well, another project I could say is the aerial mapping of agricultural area project. The mapping exercise will help and measure agricultural productivity to devise adequate marketing plans for farmers. It also examines irrigation method to provide accurate estimation of volume of irrigation water used by agricultural holdings. And the information used in this program will play then a way to lessen the pressure on groundwater through deploying sustainable irrigation methods. So those are some of the projects that could be a success stories in the UAE.
Thank you very much, Ms. Meitha, for telling us first about all the strategies implemented by the UAE. Very interesting to hear about them, but also all the success stories. Certainly, the UAE has been making drastic mitigation efforts to address these climate change threats. Finally, Ms. Meitha, very briefly, can you share with us some tips on how the public can help in minimizing the effects of the impact and risks of drought?
Of course. So actions to minimize the effects of drought, desertification could be taken at all levels. If we want to change, we should start with ourselves. Changing our behavior toward how we consume water and reduce food waste are small steps that could be taken by us, but its impact in the future will be very large and noticeable. We need to think about every action we take regarding consuming natural resources. Do we actually need this much? We need to rethink twice before over consuming anything. Everyone can participate in actions that increase our collective resilience, because every action counts. So not only public, not only citizens, business and governments and other stakeholders that have relevant expertise and in the field of drought, they need to raise awareness about the importance of this issue, so that we can all raise from drought together.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maitha. Very, very interesting and very useful tips. I think now the floor is open for questions and answers. If anybody has any questions, please do submit them through the chat box, and we'll be able to take them in turn. I think we had earlier a question specifically to Dr. Ahmed about soil management. Dr. Ahmed, would you be able to briefly tell us a little bit more about innovations and technologies that can be implemented in order to adapt to such to drought and the desertification?
Yes, actually, regarding soil management to combat desertification, there is no like one size fit all. We have first to understand what is causing desertification, because desertification, as explained, could happen to too many reasons, like overgrazing, mining, climate change, even from industry, soil pollution. So the best way to combat desertification is first to prevent it from happening, reversing what causes actually desertification in the first place. And there is different strategies we can follow. For example, nowadays you can hear the term regenerative agriculture. So it is kind of integrated approach, as my colleague Dr. Namo spoke about, selecting best crops together with improving the water retention, using, for example, the extreme events of floods to harvest water. This is very important to also to benefit from somehow from the negative impacts of climate change for harvesting water from floods. There are like pioneer projects actually happened in Arabian Peninsula for benefiting from flooding water. And of course, we need to improve the soil organic matter, because as we mentioned, soil organic matter plays a major role in improving soil structure, in improving soil tolerance to aridity or to erosion or to runoff. And here at our research center, we are doing, for example, experiments on several soil amendments that is characterized by long stability or higher stability in the soil, so it stays in the soil for a quite long time. For example, biochar is recognized by the IPCC as one of the mitigation technology for carbon sequestration and mitigation of climate change. So we are doing research on biochar. Of course, the research on soil microbes and microbial community and improving soil microbial activity in the soil will help in combating desertification.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Indeed, another positive message of hope that there are innovations that can help us combat desertification and drought. I think we have a couple more questions in the chat box from Maha. So I will be going through the first question. What are the roles of universities and schools in cut of the circle of desertification? So how can basically schools and universities contribute to combating desertification and drought? Do we have any one volunteering to answer? Any inputs?
Yeah, if I can answer to this question, if you don't mind. So from my way of thinking is that school and doing studies and doing research about the I'm sorry, I think I cut off for a moment.
We can actually hear you, Maitha, but I think it's just a video that is not, but you can carry on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think I've cut off. So I was saying that schools and university play a major role in doing science about the areas that have been degraded and about some innovative solutions to tackle the land degradation and ways to tackle drought as well. So in addition to that, as I said before, giving them awareness on how to more be aware of the way of consumption, things like not wasting food or not wasting water. Those are all behaviors that if the schools and universities are aware of, we can preserve the natural resources. So this is from my side.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Maitha. I think we have Dr. Namu. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rima, for that. So with the schools and the universities, you know, the whole issue about adapting to droughts and climate change is not a population segment. So everyone has to come in on board. And the best place to start talking about this in a manner that is friendly and in a manner that is developmental is in the schools and in the universities. In the universities, more importantly, is the link between universities and international organizations should strengthen on generating teaching materials that are up to date with technologies, up to date with the current, you know, pressing issues to do with net zero, to do with, you know, reduce the food waste, to do with how best can we save resources for the future. The future, by the way, is made up of those that are in schools. Okay, it's not made up of old people who know about the past. The future is in the future. So the most important thing that needs to happen is a collaboration between international research institutes, the ministries, government departments, schools, and universities in updating, you know, the curriculum in terms of what we are teaching in the schools and in the universities. So there is a lot of work that is going on, but maybe it's not passing on to the current curriculums in the schools and in the universities. In other words, we end up teaching people old methods of saving or reducing waste, food waste, for example. We teach them old ways of adapting to climate change, and as if climate change is not here. So there's a very interesting dynamic which needs to be unraveled. Collaborations between schools, universities, international organizations, government departments in working on the current pressing issues of climate change and drought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Namo. Of course, you raise a very, very important point. And I would like to add to that also the reason why and the vision behind having our educational programs at the Emirates Soil Museum, and also initiatives such as ICBA, so the Youth Engagement Society, that are supported by the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, but also different authorities here in the UAE, where we are happy to train and bring on board different students of different age groups, and have them work directly with scientists and in the field and have this hands-on immersive experience. I think we have another question here, which is about the role of natural-based solutions to deal with cause and effects of desertification and climate change. So if we have a very quick and brief input about this point.
I can take this question. Actually, the nature-based solutions are now widely supported by United Nations and programs to deal with the different aspects of negative impacts of climate change, including drought, desertification, and stuff. Because when we try to rehabilitate soil or try to combat drought, the intervention has to take into consideration the integrated ecosystem in the region of intervention. And the nature-based solution is a way of tackling the issues at large scale, but in the same time not disturbing the whole ecosystem. So native species that are well adapted to that environment are potentially the best way to cope with the negative impacts of climate change, but also increase resilience of an integrated ecosystem. We have been working with partners here in UAE to implement such solution or such concept in Abu Dhabi, especially in a coastal area, where we are working with the Emirate Nature and Environment Agency Abu Dhabi to rehabilitate a coastal ecosystem by focusing on nature-based solutions, especially introducing the native species such as mangrove that is widely available here in UAE, but also looking at how the whole ecosystem is benefiting from a balance between the trees, the mangrove, and other halophyte species, and the animal species as well. So yeah, nature-based solution is one of the most important solutions that now everybody is working on to tackle the global negative impact of climate change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid. Very, very interesting indeed. I do see that we have a few more questions left. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take them all because we are limited with time. However, we're very happy to welcome everyone here at ICBA, or you can reach out to us by email through our website. We'll be more than happy to discuss those different experiments happening here and initiatives. One of the questions was indeed about drought tolerant trees. I actually would like to take the opportunity to announce that we will be hosting a GAF seed extraction event at ICBA in the near future. So those of you who are based in the UAE, we welcome you to join us as we collect, extract, and sow seeds of the national tree of the UAE, which is the Ghaf. So as we know, Ghaf is a very resilient and a drought-tolerant tree. So let us all get together to combat drought one seed at a time. So we'll be sharing more details about the event on our social media platforms. I think we are now getting close to the end of our time together. For the concluding remarks, I'd like to give the floor to our Chief Scientist, Dr. Augusto.
Thank you, Rima. And I would like to thank our speakers for the insights on current research directions to make our food system more resilient into the new challenge of climate change. I want to highlight that Dr. Rashid work to understand the changes in global climate patterns globally, is going to have a very important impact locally. So Dr. Rashid's work in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa will help to make better decisions to manage, for instance, high volume of huge water precipitation in short periods of times in the Arabian Peninsula. Dr. Al-Nagar stressed the need to be mindful that the desertification processes exacerbates climate change, and climate change consequently will exacerbate the desertification process. So entering a vicious cycle that will be difficult to break. And that has a collateral damage in the loss of biodiversity of plants and microorganisms that ultimately will impoverish soil health and our capacity to sustain the food system. Dr. Namo extended this issue, explaining the efforts to adapt crops to these extreme climatic conditions, drought and high heat. And if we don't diversify our set of crops and cropping systems, the effect in sustainability of the food system will be compromised. Dr. Maita Abdullah Al-Maheri highlighted that the efforts of the Minister of Climate Change and Environment of the UAE has been deployed to protect the UAE native flora and the water resources. The ministry is actively working to combat desertification through best management practices of the UAE water table resources. And this has been successfully achieved by implementing R&D solutions in the use of water on farm levels through state-of-the-art sensors and digital methods. So my final remark would be that the home tech message is that we need to improve our R&D pipeline to best manage crops, soils, and water. And thank you very much for being participating in this webinar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Augusto, and a massive thank you to all the panelists and everyone who joined us in this very insightful discussion today. I think we all agree that desertification and droughts can be effectively tackled if there is collective will and action. With that, our webinar has now come to a close, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us again, and have a lovely